Welcome to NREI's Common Area Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the award-winning editorial staff at nreionline.com. Let's jump right into this week's podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Common Area with your host, David Bodamer. David, how are you today?
I am doing well. How are you today?
I am fantastic. I'm excited. I know that you brought another guest onto the show, so why don't you introduce our guest?
Sounds good. So this week we are a special guest. Lou Conforti, who is the CEO of Washington Prime Group, is joining us. So hi, Lou. How are you?
Good. How about yourself?
I am doing okay. I'm in Brooklyn, so it's been 4 months now of basically, I have not left the borough of Brooklyn in 4 months. So it's definitely been an experience. How are you these days?
Good. And I have continued to traveling, opening up our assets and getting people acclimated back to shopping and dining and eating. And that's so far so good.
Well, that's good to hear. So just for real quick, for any of our audience that may not know, could you just give people a snapshot of Washington Prime?
Sure. We are one of the largest owners of both enclosed and retail venues in the United States, over 100 properties, and everywhere from Hawaii to Florida and all points in between. And if you think about if we were to have a primary focus, it's serving as the dominant town center in a robust secondary trade area, whether that trade area be Kansas City or Johnson City, Tennessee, or Oahu in Hawaii. And again, we own a mix of both open air and enclosed assets, and we're doing things differently.
And so I was looking through your team sent over a bunch of really helpful documents and press releases about all of the things that your company has been doing in these recent months in terms of like first navigating, I guess, having to both doing things to help support the local community, but now also finding ways to reopen, to help your tenants out, to do even this program, this full inventory program where you've got like fulfillment centers even coming into some of your properties. So I just thought it would be like really fascinating to hear about all of that, because it seems like you've been very proactive. And right now a lot of people I think have a knee-jerk they hear retail real estate, it's in a lot of trouble, a lot of concerns about what's been happening. It looks like though, in your portfolio you've been fairly aggressive and assertive and kind of coming up with a bunch of ways to help the properties continue to operate, to help your tenants. So I'm just like to hear about some of that stuff.
Sure. Well, it's probably because I don't know any better. So I was brought in by David Simon and the board about 4 years ago. We're a SPG, a Simon Property Group spinoff, and one of the things I was adamant about implementing is anything other than the status quo. And I'm only being half facetious. Mm-hmm. One of the fundamental issues with this sector and with physical retailing in general, it was insipid. It was passive. Mm-hmm. There was no thought of curation. And to a Brooklynite, I know, I'm going to try to use as many hipster words as I can. So, curation. I know you're distilling something at any given, and because everyone in Brooklyn distills something, and farm to table. All right, I think I've exhausted my hipster buzzwords, but the onus of burden rested upon the shoulders of the landlords, and I would contend for the last couple decades, it was just absolute passivity. We were rent collectors versus as opposed to operators. I need you to talk more about the some of the cool shit we're doing, and if you want me to go there. So during this godforsaken, awful, coronavirus pandemic, which, first and foremost, I care about human lives, whether they're colleagues or guests. I just thought, as did my colleagues, that we can sit on our asses, or we proactively address the needs of our demographic constituents. And I will tell you, so we started an initiative called WPT Cares, and we have recently completed our 500th community service project. And we have 100% participation throughout the country in all of our assets. And they range from medical distribution facilities to COVID-19, I guess you call them testing stations, to feeding essential workers, to providing daycare, to, the list goes on. And we really were adamant about working with those municipal or local and regional or state, officials and the nonprofits to see what we can do. And it ultimately is, does it inure to the benefit of us as a company? But more importantly, it inures to the benefit of us as human beings. And I can't tell you how blown away I am by my colleagues, both corporately and those on the ground, whether it be in pouring rain, dishing out meals, and just it's been an amazing focus. So that, I guess, that philanthropic endeavor, something that was extraordinarily important to us. And we thought, okay, during a time of, the vast majority of our assets and tenants, taking a break as a result of this exogenous shock that hit everybody, what can we do to buttress and, strengthen up our tenants, both big and small? So as it relates to small, we did something that has gained national recognition, and we did something called Open for Small Business. You go on our website, and it has its own website, and very simply, it is a collaboration with the University of Chicago with Steve Levitt, who's the author of Freakonomics, a dear friend of mine, and Richard Thaler, who won a recent Nobel laureate. And these guys were thinking about things big picture, macroeconomic, about what is the iterative impact of having local entrepreneurs go out of business. And I'm not that smart. I was thinking in a much more practicalist standpoint. Long story short, we got together, provided universal templated lease modification agreements, and then began hosting webinars. At first, those webinars were about, how to get a guarantee, what we call it, an SBA 7A guaranteed loan. And they've expanded to leadership, how to merchandise, to yoga classes, to mental health, to physical health. And that's something we're going to continue, and we'll bring it to the physical as times and conditions warrant. So WPG Cares, Open for Small Business. And then I'll group the last several things we did. Well, and then we can chat about it Fulventary in a moment if I may. But these were the things we did were just really catering to our tenants and understanding that the world isn't binary. It's not e-commerce or physical space, and only one is going to exist. And, unless you live in your mother's basement, shouting for meatloaf like Will Ferrell, people are going to get out, and they like that society. They like that in the human interaction. And, so we try to, strike a delicate balance between physical space and e-commerce. And we did something called well-picked goods, where we were highlighting interesting goods that obviously, as our stores were closed, the only way to get them was online. Several other initiatives, and the thing that you had mentioned, David, was Full Inventory, which is our last mile fulfillment initiative. And very simply, what we do is we combine last mile fulfillment and the ability to buy online, pick up in store, buy online, return in store, the I think the acronyms of BOPIS and BORIS. And for us, more importantly, our tenancy, there are really measurable and quantifiable benefits of doing as such. One, you engage in a pickup or a return, you're more likely, you're more apt. I think on average you spend about $1.20 for every dollar returned, just in ancillary goods and perhaps services. So these are folks that have a proven, that are proven purchasers of consumer products, and for whatever reason they might find it more efficient to pick it up in our assets, and as a result, it's reciprocally beneficial. We get increased traffic. They have the ability to upsell or incrementally sell more goods. It's a amenity for our guests, and that we make it very simple. So we started beta testing these and smaller square footages, and the response has been extraordinary. It really has blown us away to the extent that we've done a couple very large 80,000 square foot deals. And here, the long story short, and I'll quiet down, is there's a symbiotic relationship between physical space and e-commerce. And shame on my sector for not understanding and nurturing that relationship.
One of the examples of that is at the Morgantown Mall in West Virginia, correct? Where you took what was a former Sears location and turned it into one of these fulfillment centers?
That's exactly right. Dedicated to West Virginia universities, I believe it's their health system or their medical system, their health system. So that's one of the big ones. Mm-hmm. And we have several more traditional inline retailers that want 8 assets, or that have chosen, for instance, we were just on the phone yesterday, they want 8 locations where they could have, think about it as their ability to provide hub and spoke fulfillment in a region. Generally our assets are well located, situated off of an interstate. There's enough population density, so on and so forth.
Right. I mean, that makes a lot of sense because, just the demographics of a site that you put a mall in is by definition going to be in an area that's good to access, easy to access, and that's got a certain trade area around it, right? So it's like the kind of the fundamentals that make it a good mall kind of seem to would reinforce this idea that it would be also work for this other purpose.
That's exactly right, and it's a willingness or a kind of the reality check, which, unfortunately many of my peers have been reluctant to do, is to understand that we are in the curation business, and that curation isn't wholly exclusive to, junior fashion and accessories, which we do a lot of demographic data parsing and coefficient weighted analyses. When I came in, I quickly recognized that our assets, and it's just not our assets, the industry was long 43%. So think about it, every 4 out of every 10 tenants was dedicated to junior fashion and accessories. Now, I love to wear a good midriff t-shirt with, and as much as the next person. I'm obviously kidding. My daughters are going to be appalled as they listen to this. But holy cow, we have just stiff-armed huge swaths of our demographic constituencies by not providing them interesting things. And there are plenty of interesting, lifestyle-oriented goods and services that we should be providing. And it truly is hyper-exaggerated or emphasized in our dominant secondary town center focus, because we are, I guess, definitionally the dominant town center. And, 3/4 of our, what people call malls, and I hate saying the word mall, but I'll say it anyway. 3/4 of our malls have a lifestyle and open air component to them, and I would reckon that number is only going to increase. So it's incumbent, or it's imperative that we serve. We're all things to all people, and again, not just those national retailers that were that with very little differentiation between brands.
Right. I mean, the Washington Prime portfolio, right, is a lot of the stuff that that Glimcher was part of the Glimcher Glimcher company, like Polaris Town Center, like those kind of assets that I remember from when they were being built. I don't even remember how long ago, but I remember speaking with Michael Glimcher back in those days about the development of these more town center, like you're saying, like what I think of Glimcher as being like this, strongly positioned player in secondary markets with these kind of assets that were not just your traditional regional malls. And I think that's a lot of what's in now the portfolio that remains in the portfolio, correct?
Yeah. Yep, you're spot on. And what we've done is, implemented, I don't know if people say 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, but, the next, kind of array of lifestyle offerings. And, Polaris, for example, what we've done with Polaris, quite frankly, what our leasing professional and property management teams, I just cattle prod, and then they tell me to, quiet down. But what my colleagues have done in Polaris and pretty much everywhere else has been amazing. We're building a Field House USA, which averages, I'll err on the lower side, I think 800 to 1 million visitors annually. So you think about, and these are children and parents that for organized sporting activities and a host of other athletic activities. And you think, derivatively, what else should we be offering a guardian, a kid, in addition, other than the same old, same old. So in conjunction with that, we've done a lot of common area activation, which, quite frankly, is free. It's free. We started something called the Yard, which is, think about it as an adult play area. We're doing a lot of local craft breweries. We're doing drive-in movies, and we actually started with that at the onset of COVID, where we just wanted to maintain relevancy and provide an amenity for our guests. So there's always a big blank, department store wall. Mm-hmm. And with some video technology, we've seen some pretty cool movies. We've had our concert series for years, which in some places average 20,000 people over the course of a 2 or 3 day weekend. So what can we do to continue to satisfy both the commodity needs as well as the discretionary needs of our tenants? And it's unlimited. It's truly unlimited. I'll also mention one other thing with respect to this, is that I kind of had fun with Brooklyn a couple minutes back, but I will go toe for toe that Peoria on a per capita basis, or Johnson City, or take your pick, with over 100 assets, that on a per capita basis, we have as many hipsters doing cool things as Brooklyn. And we really haven't provided a venue for that local artisan, that small batch bourbon distiller, that, and it's been ridiculous because with this, the industry waited with their hands out and acted as rent collectors, and that's why they got, that's why they got nothing interesting for so long.
Right. It becomes more
like and I'm not denigrating. I'm sorry, go on.
I was gonna say, like, it's the general like commodification of the asset class, where a lot of the malls, the stereotype of malls just being very redundant about the same kind of tenanting and the same kind of being very uniform, as opposed to
David, you can walk blindfolded, not in our assets, and with a high degree of expectancy, with certainty, you can tell, you can name those assets. I'm sorry, those the inline tenants, because it was just rote and methodical. There was no curation, and curation not only manifests itself with tenant diversification, but with common area activation. And we've done everything. And again, I'm obviously very cognizant of the pause we're taking with respect to coronavirus. But right before we did I believe it was in January or February, we beta tested 8 assets with, then did a TikTok social media influencer campaign. Over the course of 2 days in those 8 assets, we had 12,000 discrete visitors. I'd never seen anything like it, and 54 million views on our page.
Wow.
And we did it for an older demographic, I think 6 months previous, with a couple of Martha Stewart, I shouldn't say wannabes, but, and we have the ability to focus on analytically, provide the analytics or to perform the analyses that allow us to better understand our demographics. Again, the rent collection mindset of this space was appalling.
There was one other thing I wanted to pivot to, which was looking at the company website. This emphasis on ESG and the responsibility, that responsibility for the company. So I was wondering if you could talk about how that has influenced, the strategy and why you see that as an important way to be positioning the company on that front.
Well, and I can talk. I think it's important to separate the E, the S, and the G. Mm-hmm. And I might spend too much time on the S, which is very important to me, and it's been to my family, and I'm not eschewing all things environmental. And of course, our corporate governance is regarded as some of the best on the street with more visibility via supplemental. But as it relates to the S, the social, it's not good. It's certainly good for the company, but the polarization, and this is where I do get in trouble for being overtly, opinionated with respect to my social liberalism, but how dare us not respect fellow human beings? That's all I'll say about that. So I can talk about the E and the G. Environmental, we're always beta testing interesting things. Cheryl Van Hatten runs that as a technology for us. Talk to her. She is absolutely amazing. And I'm going to sound stupid because, those types of implementations, we're obviously certainly doing them. But I stick to my knitting in that regard. But in our governance, we're generally recognized as the best provider of supplemental information and just extra information. And that's just based upon my perspective of we have a fiduciary, and how dare us and me if I don't provide more versus less. So the social, in summary, is something that it pains me to see the polarization that's occurring in this country, and I'm not going to go on anymore because then I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to get in trouble by somebody.
Okay, I think that seems like a good place to leave things then. So I definitely want to thank you so much for coming on and giving all these highlights and talking about everything that the company's been up to. Is very very helpful, and definitely been very curious about hearing what's happening on the ground and with some of these retail assets, just like in this strange time that we're in. So I appreciate you so much kind of taking us through all that.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and the burden that rests upon landlord shoulders, on tenants' shoulders, and there needs to be more collaboration between the landlord and tenancy, and just work towards satisfying what our guests want. I mean, I think in many instances we've lost sight of that. Thank you all.
All right, guys, this was a great podcast. David, thank you so much for bringing him on. Great information, again, as usual. And, of course, the last thank you goes to you, the listening audience. Thank you for listening and tuning in to the Common Area Podcast with David Bodamer. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when David comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your friends and colleagues. Again, thanks for listening today. For everyone at NREI, this is Eric Johnson inviting you back in 2 weeks for all the stories that matter to you. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Common Area Podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of NREI or Informa. The content has been made available for information and educational purposes only.